Ravi asks, do you think our history needs to be rewritten? Great question. Should India's history textbooks be rewritten? And my answer to that is 100% yes, they should. So let me explain why I say this. So if you look at India's education system, it is a relic of the British Raj. It is more or less the same system that the British instituted more than a century ago. It's a relic of the 19th century education system that the British instituted in India. And after India got its independence in 1947, India's new rulers continued the same education system. And what's worse is that they outsourced the writing of India's history textbooks to Marxist historians. And what we see in India's history textbooks today is a consequence of all that. So if we look at the textbooks, we find that there are a number of recurring deficiencies, whether the textbook is at the school level, the college level, or even at the PhD level. We find that the overall chronology of India's history remains more or less the same as it should. However, the problems lie in the details. So what we see is that there are numerous gaps, there are omissions, there are distortions in the way India's history is written and depicted. There is a consistent colonial and Hindu-phobic narrative that is woven throughout the accounts of India's history. And there is a consistent glorification of foreign invaders, occupiers, and colonialists. And what we see is that there is also a blanket whitewashing of the genocides and the crimes against humanity that these foreign powers perpetrated in India. So let's take a look at a few examples. Now, you must have heard of the Aryan invasion theory. India's history textbooks treat the Aryan invasion theory as a de facto self-evident gospel truth. So the fact is that the Aryan invasion theory is a colonial narrative. It was created during the colonial era in the 19th century, and later on, after independence, it was championed by the Marxists and it acquired Marxist qualities. And there is an immense amount of scientific and empirical evidence that completely demolishes every aspect of this theory. I myself have written several articles about that debunk this theory, and there are many scholars who have written books and articles and research papers, and if you look at all of this evidence together as a whole, it totally annihilates the Aryan invasion theory. And despite this, India's history textbooks continue to portray the Aryan invasion theory as the self-evident gospel truth. So that's a huge problem that we find in India's history textbooks. The other thing is that India's local histories have been completely erased from Indian history textbooks. Think about Assam, for example. Do you know anything about the history of Assam? I bet you don't. Assam has a rich and interesting and fascinating history, and it's never spoken about. It's never mentioned in India's history textbooks. Think about the Maratha Empire. The Marathas were the power that destroyed, annihilated the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire was ended by the Marathas, and the Maratha Empire stretched from the south of India all the way to the borders of Tibet, and it included parts of Afghanistan. Now, how many of you know this? India's history textbooks do not mention this. The Marathas reconquered India and established Hindavi Swaraj in India. But this is a fact that is completely glossed over in India's history textbooks. What about Rajputana? What about Gujarat? What do we learn about these places in India's history textbooks? We learn next to nothing. if you think about Gujarat, it's got an incredibly ancient history. It was the seat of, it was not entirely, but it was partially the seat of the Harappan civilization. So it's got a very ancient history, and even its recent history is very interesting. It's got its own distinctive culture, but you will not see this mentioned anywhere in India's history textbooks. Think about Manipur, for example. Can you even place Manipur on the map of India? Most people can't. Most people haven't even heard of Manipur. Manipur has a fascinating and vibrant culture. It's the last bastion of Hinduism in India, and its history goes back, its recorded written history goes back more than 2000 years. It has a lineage of kings that goes back more than 2000 years, and yet you will never see a word about Manipur in India's history textbooks. Think about Kalinga, Magad. What about Gandhara? Most people cannot place these locations on India's map. Of course, Gandhara is now not within the political boundaries of India as of today, but it was historically very much part of India. And these places have very interesting, fascinating, and rich histories that we never get to hear about, that we never get to learn about. And it's a shame, isn't it? Because India as a civilization is made up of all these different individual local histories and cultures. And this is something that we should learn about. But that's not what happens. It's totally blanked out from India's history textbooks. The Indian history textbooks are pretty much single track and one dimensional. What about how India influenced other countries in its neighborhood and beyond? How did India influence Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea? Do we know about this? What about how India influenced Central Asia or Europe? So let's talk about Southeast Asia, for example. Has anybody heard of the Chola dynasty? The Chola dynasty happens to be the longest ruling dynasty in the history of the world. The Chola dynasty was established around 300 BCE, and it ruled over large parts of South India and far beyond that until approximately in the 13th century. So that gives it a span of about 1,500 years, which is incredible. And we never get to hear about this in India's history textbooks. Now, the Cholas, they conquered vast parts of Southeast Asia. They conquered Sri Lanka, they conquered the Maldives, they conquered parts of Myanmar, of Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Laos, Vietnam, and their influence spread all the way to the Philippines. And what the Cholas did was that they they patronized and propagated Sanskrit and Hinduism throughout Southeast Asia. What you find today is that the grandest and most magnificent examples of Hindu temple architecture are found not in India, but in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, and elsewhere. It's because of the Chola influence. And this completely demolishes the lie that Tamil culture is distinct and separate from Indian or Hindu culture, because the Cholas were a Tamil dynasty. So India had an immense amount of influence over Southeast Asia. What about China? The Chinese scholar Hu Shi said that India was able to conquer China culturally without ever sending a single soldier across the Himalayas. And this was done not by soldiers, but by scholars. India sent scholars to these places. You must have heard of the Shaolin Temple, the birthplace of Kung Fu. Well, do you know that the Shaolin Temple was constructed for Indian scholars? It was created to house Indian scholars who would translate Sanskrit sutras into Chinese. And one of these scholars was an Indian monk whose name was Bodhidharma. And he is the one who introduced a martial art to China, which is now known as Kung Fu. So Bodhidharma is the first patriarch of the Shaolin temple. There's a giant statue of Bodhidharma on top of a hill that overlooks the temple. And Bodhidharma is the father of Kung Fu. He is the one who introduced this Indian martial art into China. And of course, I'm not saying it's an Indian martial art. The Chinese developed it, expanded it, and they made it what it is today. But its origins lie in India. And Bodhidharma was not just a Kung Fu master, he was a Dhyana master. He introduced the practice of Dhyana meditation into China. And the Chinese call it Chan instead of Dhyana because they pronounce things differently. And Chinese monks carried this practice into Japan, where it was renamed as Zen. So Zen Buddhism is nothing but Dhyana meditation. And that's how far India's influence spread. Now, if you look at Japan, its entire culture is based upon a bedrock of Indian culture. Buddhism is very much part of Japanese culture. It is now part of a syncretic culture with Shintoism. And there are lots of Hindu practices in Japan. Many Hindu gods and goddesses such as Ganesha and Saraswati and many others are worshipped in Japan under Hindu names. And you still see Sanskrit sutras being chanted in Japan. You will see inscriptions in the Sharda script in Japan. So the Japanese culture is entirely based upon a bedrock of Indian culture. So Japan is a dharmic nation, and it is the world's most advanced nation. So that's what dharmic culture can do. So you don't get to learn any of this in India's history textbooks, how India's influence spread so far and wide. It also spread to Korea. And what about Central Asia? The whole of Central Asia was immersed in Indian culture before the Turkic and the Mongol invasions. The Gandhari language was once the lingua franca of Central Asia. And if you look westward to Europe, there's also a huge amount of evidence that Indian culture spread far and wide. Not just Indian culture, but Indian people and Indian genetics spread far and wide all the way to the westernmost reaches of Europe. And you will not see India's history textbooks mention even a word about any of these things. And isn't that a crying shame? Now, what about how Islam entered India? Well, clearly, the people who brought Islam into India did not come as legal immigrants. They did not apply for visas. They barged in, they invaded, they plundered, they destroyed. And this is not mentioned in India's history textbooks. It is whitewashed out. The Islamic genocides, the Islamic genocide of India is entirely whitewashed. Not a word of it will be found in any Indian history textbook, not even obliquely. If you look at the statistics of the Islamic genocide of India, you can find the statistics which are meticulously recorded in the accounts of various Muslim chroniclers who accompanied the Islamic invaders into India. And if you tally it up, you can see that the numbers are staggering. One can easily estimate a figure of, at the very least, 100 million deaths over a number of centuries, over about 5 centuries in India. That's a very conservative figure. Akbar, for example. Do your textbooks tell you that Akbar had 30,000 surrendered Rajput warriors beheaded in just one single day in Chittorgarh? No, they won't. Even the New York Times agrees that Aurangzeb was responsible for genocide. According to New York Times statistics, he was responsible for the deaths of at least 4 million Indians, who obviously were Hindus. And these are extraordinarily conservative figures. The real figures are very much higher. And none of these things are alluded to in India's history textbooks. Our texts will not tell us about how Christianity entered India. They will not tell us about the horrors and the barbarity of the Goa Inquisition, which the Portuguese carried out with the help of Francis Xavier. They will not tell us about how lots of people in India became Christian, how this religion entered Indian society. This will never be mentioned anywhere. The word Inquisition won't be found anywhere. And India's history textbooks will not tell you anything about the genocide that the British perpetrated in India. In the aftermath of the 1857 War of Independence, in just a few years, the British killed at least 10 million Indians in revenge for the uprising. The British created artificial famines in India year after year after year, and they killed at least 100 million Indians by doing so, by creating artificial famines. And these famines resulted in epidemics as well, and that's what caused so many deaths. But these were all indirect deaths. They were not deaths by gunshots or by the sword. And yet there was a genocide, just like the Irish famine that the British created in the 19th century. And if you take a look at just one famine, the Bengal famine during the Second World War, at least 4 to 6 million Bengalis died during that. And that was entirely avoidable. It was a deliberate step taken by Winston Churchill to starve these people. So none of these things are mentioned in our history textbooks. What about the origin of India's civilization? Do your textbooks ever ask the question of who are the Indian people? What is their origin? What is the origin of India's culture and civilization? How old is India's culture and civilization? Here's the fact. According to archaeological evidence, India's civilization is at least 9,000 years old. And according to genetic evidence, according to the age of the lineage that is most common in Indian males, the R1A1A lineage, according to that evidence, Indian civilization is at least 15 to 18,000 years old. Now, India's textbooks will not tell you any of these things either, right? And what about the economic history of India? It's well known that before the Islamic invasions began, India's economy accounted for at least a third of the entire world's GDP. And the decline in India's GDP started during the Islamic invasions, and India's GDP crashed dramatically after the British occupation of India. So when the British began their occupation, India's GDP was still approximately a third of the entire world's GDP. But when the British left India, India's GDP was, I would say, about 2% of the world's GDP. So imagine where all that money went. And you would see a corresponding rise in Britain's share of the world's GDP. So none of these things are ever mentioned in India's history textbooks. What about India's contributions to science and mathematics? It is well known that Indian mathematicians discovered calculus at least 300 years before Newton and Leibniz. And India's contributions to mathematics are immense, but you will not see this mentioned anywhere. So there are so many problems, right? There are so many omissions and distortions in our history textbooks, and that's why I strongly recommend that we should revise them. We should rewrite them. And what is the effect that all of this has on India? Well, what you have is that you have millions and millions of impressionable young Indians who get brainwashed by the propaganda and the narratives in India's textbooks. It alienates them from their own culture, their own civilization, their own religion. It evokes a sense of self-loathing, of being ashamed of who you are and of your own culture and religion and your civilization. It creates a feeling of immense inferiority compared to anybody else, compared to all other cultures. Indians are told that their culture is misogynistic, it is casteist, and so on and so forth. And these these narratives and lies are internalized by Indian children at a very early age. And it's very difficult to deprogram your mind of something that you've been indoctrinated with in your childhood. So what the Indian education system does is that it catches Indians young and indoctrinates them with lies. It implants false beliefs into the nation's psyche and consciousness, and it makes Indians worship false heroes. And there's so much more that it does. It causes immense harm to India as a nation, as a society, and as a civilization. And that is why I strongly recommend that the government should take up this project of rewriting India's history textbooks.